The fog clung to the village like a damp shroud, curling around the edges of my greenhouse as I worked late into the night. I'm just a gardener, or so I tell myself, tending to roses and ferns in this quiet corner of the world. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and something sharper, metallic ever since I'd spilled a bit of my own blood while pruning last week. I'd nicked my hand on a thorn and the drops had soaked into the soil beneath a cluster of lilies. By morning, those lilies had tripled in size, their petals glistening like they'd been dipped in oil, and I couldn't shake the feeling they were watching me. I thought it was a fluke at first, some quirk of the soil or a forgotten fertilizer mix. But curiosity got the better of me, so I tried it again, this time deliberately dripping blood from a cut on my finger into a pot of ivy. The vines twisted and stretched overnight, coiling up the glass walls like they were reaching for something. I stood there, heart pounding, as the leaves rustled without a breeze, forming shapes that looked too much like faces. By the third night, I was feeding them more. Blood from a butcher's bucket, thick and dark, poured into the roots of every plant I could spare. The greenhouse became a jungle, alive with colors no natural flower should have. Then the whispers started. I was locking up one night, the moon barely a sliver, when I heard it, a low, breathy voice calling my name from the rose bushes. It wasn't human, not quite, but it knew things, secrets I'd buried deep, like the money I'd taken from the church collection years ago, or the night I'd watched a neighbor's barn burn and said nothing. The roses were loudest, their thorns gleaming like tiny teeth, and they promised to keep quiet if I gave them more food. I laughed it off at first, thinking I'd gone mad, but the voices followed me to my cottage, seeping through the walls. I started avoiding the greenhouse after dark, but the plants didn't like that. One night I woke to the sound of scratching at my window, and there they were, vines pressing against the glass, their tips tapping like impatient fingers. I grabbed my lantern and stumbled outside, my breath catching as I saw the shadows shift inside the greenhouse. The plants were moving, not just swaying, but crawling, their stems twisting into shapes that mimicked arms and legs. I stood frozen, the lantern trembling in my hand as a fern uncurled and pointed straight at me, its fronds dripping with something too red to be sap. By the time I locked myself back in the cottage, my heart was a hammer in my chest. The whispers were louder now, not just in the greenhouse, but in my head, demanding more blood, more nutrients. I thought of the butcher, the pigs he slaughtered weekly, but the roses hissed that animal blood wasn't enough anymore. I sat by the fire, clutching a knife, wondering how far this would go. The village was quiet, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the plants were listening, waiting for me to make a choice I'd never come back from. Morning broke over the village, gray and cold, but I couldn't bring myself to step outside. The greenhouse loomed in my mind, its glass walls fogged with condensation, hiding whatever those plants were becoming. I'd spent the night by the fire, the knife still in my hand, listening for the scratching that never came again. When I finally peered out the window, the vines had retreated from the glass, but the roses were taller, their blooms pressed against the greenhouse roof like they were trying to break free. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but my gut knew better. I avoided the greenhouse all day, busying myself with chores in the village, fixing a fence, hauling water, anything to stay away. But people noticed. Old Mrs. Carter, with her sharp eyes, asked why my flowers weren't at the market yet. I mumbled something about pests and hurried off, but her gaze lingered, and I felt the weight of the plants' whispers even in the open air. They were calling me back, their voices slithering through my thoughts, promising to spill my secrets if I didn't feed them soon. By dusk, I was sweating despite the chill, my hands shaking as I gripped a bucket of butcher's blood I'd bought on credit. Back at the greenhouse, the air was thick, almost suffocating, with a sweet rot that made my stomach turn. I poured the blood into the soil, watching it soak in like the earth was drinking. The plants shuddered, leaves twitching as if they were breathing, and the whispers softened to a hum, satisfied for now. But then I heard it, a scream, sharp and human, from the far end of the greenhouse. I dropped the bucket, my boots slipping in the mud, and ran toward the sound. There was nothing, no one, just a cluster of lilies swaying in a breeze that wasn't there. I stood there, heart racing, when the lilies spoke. Not my name this time, but hers, Lila, the baker's daughter who'd gone missing last spring. The voice was hers, soft and pleading, begging me to find her. I tore through the soil with my hands, half expecting to find bones, but there was only dirt and roots that pulsed like veins. The lilies laughed, a sound that cut through me, and I stumbled back, realizing they weren't mimicking Lila. They were taunting me with her voice, daring me to dig deeper. I fled to the cottage, barring the door, but the whispers followed, louder now, weaving through the cracks in the walls. The plants were hungry, and animal blood wouldn't do anymore. They wanted something warmer, something alive. I sat in the dark, the knife in my lap, staring at the greenhouse through the window. Its silhouette was wrong, the glass bulging outward like it was breathing. I knew I couldn't run forever. The village was too small, and the plants knew too much. Tomorrow I'd have to decide what to feed them, or who. The village woke to a brittle dawn, but I hadn't slept. My eyes burned from staring at the greenhouse through the night, its shape warping in the moonlight until it looked like a crouching beast. The whispers had quieted, but their absence was worse, like a predator holding its breath before the strike. I gripped the knife tighter, its blade nicked from my nervous fidgeting, and told myself I'd burn the whole place down before I'd let those plants win. But the thought of fire made the roses hiss in my mind, promising to scream my secrets to the village if I tried. I forced myself to the market, needing the noise of people to drown out the silence. The villagers bustled around, oblivious, their chatter about missing livestock and strange noises in the woods prickling my skin. I caught fragments of talk about Lila, how her father still left candles burning in her window, hoping she'd come home. My hands shook as I set up my stall, empty of flowers. And when Mrs. Carter asked again why I had nothing to sell, I snapped at her to mind her own business. Her eyes narrowed, and I swear the ivy curling around my fence twitched as she walked away. By midday, I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed a shovel and marched to the greenhouse, determined to rip those cursed plants out by the roots. The air inside was suffocating, thick with that rotting sweetness, and the lilies were waiting. They didn't speak, but their petals pulsed, red veins glowing faintly under the glass. I swung the shovel at a fern, but it lashed out, its fronds slicing my arm like razor wire. Blood dripped onto the soil, and the plants shuddered, a low moan rising from the dirt that froze me in place. Then I saw it, a shadow moving behind the roses, too tall to be a plant, too human to be anything else. I called out, my voice cracking, but the figure vanished, leaving only the echo of footsteps crunching on glass. I searched every corner, heart hammering, and found a scrap of cloth caught on a thorn, stained with something dark and sticky. It smelled like Lila's perfume, the kind she wore when she'd bring bread to the market. The roses whispered her name again, laughing, and I stumbled back, the shovel slipping from my hands. I locked myself in the cottage again, the cloth clutched in my fist. The plants were playing with me, but I couldn't tell if Lila was really gone or if they'd taken her, trapped her somehow in that cursed soil. The whispers grew louder, not just in my head now, but outside, circling the house like wolves. They wanted more than blood. They wanted me to bring someone to them. I stared at the knife, then at the village lights flickering in the distance, and wondered who I could sacrifice to keep those voices quiet. The night pressed against my cottage, heavy and suffocating, as if the air itself was conspiring with the greenhouse. I hadn't slept in days, my mind fraying under the constant hum of the plants' voices, now a chorus of demands that clawed at my thoughts. The scrap of Lila's cloth lay on the table, its edges curling like it was alive. And every time I looked at it, the roses whispered her name, mocking me with memories of her smile. I'd barred the door, nailed the windows shut, but the vines were creeping closer, their tips probing the cracks in the walls. I clutched the knife, its weight my only anchor, and swore I'd never give them what they wanted. Morning brought no relief. The village felt different now, its streets too quiet, the faces of my neighbors too watchful. I caught whispers, not the plants this time, but the villagers, murmuring about my empty stall and the strange lights flickering in my greenhouse at night. Old Mrs. Carter cornered me by the well, her voice low, asking if I'd seen anything odd in the woods where Lila disappeared. I lied, said I hadn't, but her eyes lingered on the fresh cuts on my arm, and I felt the plant's laughter ripple through me, as if they'd heard every word. I couldn't stay away any longer. Armed with a torch and the shovel, I stormed into the greenhouse at noon, when the sun was strongest, hoping daylight would weaken them. The air was thick, the plants unnaturally still, their leaves gleaming like polished blades. I aimed the shovel at the lilies, but before I could strike, the ground shifted beneath me, roots bursting through the soil like fingers. They wrapped around my ankles, cold and slick, pulling me down until I was face to face with a rose bush that opened its blooms to reveal teeth, human teeth, glinting in the light. I screamed, slashing with the knife, and the roots let go, but not before they drew blood. I scrambled out, dropping the torch, which sputtered in the dirt but didn't catch. As I stumbled back, I saw it, a figure again, this time clearer, standing among the ferns. It was Lila, or something wearing her face, her eyes hollow and her mouth moving without sound. She pointed to the soil, where something pale and bony protruded, and I froze, my breath catching as I realized it was a finger, still wearing her ring. The plants hissed, their voices a chorus now, telling me to bring someone new, someone alive, or they'd drag me into the earth with her. Back in the cottage, I collapsed, the knife clattering to the floor. The whispers were everywhere, seeping from the walls, the floor, even the air I breathed. They named people Mrs. Carter, the butcher, the boy who delivered milk, promising silence if I fed them just one. I stared at the village through my window, its lights dim and distant, and felt the weight of the choice crushing me. The plants weren't just hungry, they were hunting, and I was their hands. I gripped the knife again, my eyes on the butcher's house, and wondered how much blood it would take to make them stop. The village slept under a moonless sky, but I was wide awake, the knife heavy in my hand as I stared at the butcher's house across the field. The plants' whispers had become a roar, filling my skull with promises and threats, their voices weaving a net I couldn't escape. They'd shown me Lila's finger, her ring glinting in the dirt, and I knew it wasn't a trick. The greenhouse was a graveyard, and I was its keeper. I told myself I'd burn it down tomorrow, but the roses hissed that fire wouldn't stop them. Not now, not when they were so close to breaking free. My only choice was to obey or be buried. I crept through the dark, avoiding the creaking floorboards of my cottage, the knife tucked into my belt. The butcher was a loner, a gruff man who wouldn't be missed for days, and the plants purred at the thought of his blood. I reached his door, my heart pounding so loud I swore it would wake the village, when a scream tore through the night. Not from the butcher's house, but from the greenhouse. I turned, frozen, as the glass walls glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Against every instinct, I ran toward it, the whispers urging me on. Inside, the air was alive, thick with the stench of decay and something worse, something human. The plants were moving, not just swaying, but slithering, their vines weaving a cage around a figure thrashing in the center. It was the milk boy, barely 16, his eyes wide with terror as thorns pierced his skin, drawing blood that the roots drank eagerly. I lunged forward, slashing with the knife, but the vines caught my wrist, twisting until I dropped it. The boy's screams turned to gurgles, and the lilies sang in his voice, mocking me for thinking I could choose who they took. I stumbled back, the boy's body sinking into the soil, his hand the last to vanish, clutching at nothing. The plants turned to me, their leaves curling like smiles, and I saw bones scattered in the dirt. Dozens, maybe hundreds, some fresh, some crumbling. The roses spoke, their voices sharp and clear. They didn't need me to bring them prey anymore. They could hunt on their own. I ran, tripping over roots that seemed to chase me, and barely made it out before the vines slammed the door shut behind me. Back in the cottage, I barricaded myself in, my breath ragged, the whispers now a deafening chant. The greenhouse glowed brighter, its light seeping through my walls, and I heard footsteps outside, not human, but the slow, deliberate crunch of roots on gravel. The plants were coming for me, for the village, and I knew I couldn't stop them alone. I clutched the knife, my eyes on the village lights, and realized I had one last chance to warn someone. But who would believe a man haunted by his own garden? Dawn broke over the village, but it brought no hope, only a sickly light that made the greenhouse glow like a festering wound. I hadn't slept, my hands trembling around the knife as the whispers turned to screams, not just in my head, but echoing from every corner of my cottage. The plants were done waiting. They were moving, their roots cracking the greenhouse glass, their vines spilling out like a tide of green and red. I'd seen the milk boy vanish into the soil, his bones joining the others, and I knew the plants wouldn't stop until the village was theirs. I had to act, even if it meant facing the truth I'd been running from. I grabbed a lantern and a canister of oil, determined to burn the greenhouse to ash. As I stepped outside, the air was wrong. Too still, too heavy, and the village was silent. No dogs barking, no smoke from chimneys. I reached the greenhouse, my boots sinking into mud that pulsed like flesh, and saw the vines had spread, coiling around trees, fences, even the church steeple in the distance. I poured the oil, my hands slick with sweat, but before I could light it, the roses screamed, not my name, but hers, Lila's, in a voice so real I dropped the lantern. The glass shattered, oil pooling uselessly, and I saw her again, standing among the ferns, her face pale but whole, beckoning me inside. I stepped through the broken door, knife raised, and the plants parted, letting me pass. Lila stood there, not a vision, but flesh and blood, her eyes wide with fear, but alive. She whispered my name, said she'd been trapped in the roots, kept alive by the plant's will, her blood feeding them while they mimicked her voice. I reached for her, but the vines snapped shut around us, thorns piercing my arms, and Lila's scream turned to laughter. Not hers, but the plants, their voices a chorus of every soul they'd taken. The ground opened, roots pulling us down, and I slashed wildly, freeing Lila just long enough for us to stumble toward the door. We burst into the open, gasping, but the village was gone. Houses smothered in vines, streets choked with roots that writhed like veins. Lila clung to me, sobbing, but her grip was too strong, her skin too cold. I looked into her eyes and saw no reflection, only a glint of green, and my blood froze as her mouth split into a grin too wide for a human face. She wasn't Lila. She was them, the plants, wearing her body like a mask, and as her hands tightened, thorns sprouted from her fingers, sinking into my chest. I screamed, but the vines were everywhere, dragging me back into the greenhouse, where the soil opened like a mouth. The last thing I saw was the village, swallowed by a sea of green, and Lila's face above me, her smile blooming into petals as the roots pulled me under. But the true horror wasn't the plants. It was the realization that I'd never been the gardener. I was the soil, tilled and fed by my own blood, my secrets the seeds they'd grown from. The plants hadn't lured me. I'd planted them, my guilt giving them life, and now they'd claimed me, my bones joining the garden I'd sown. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single voice, mine, calling from the roses, luring the next soul to feed the roots.